The French Farmhouse and the Mysterious Woman. I don't know much about the history of my house, except that it's a French farmhouse built over a century ago. We moved here when I was 7. The old stone walls and faded blue-gray stained glass windows always gave me a sense of unease. Even as a carefree child, my parents loved the rustic charm of the house, but my brother and I never shared their enthusiasm. The strange noises began as soon as we moved in. First, they were just faint creaks on the wooden floors late at night, as if someone was walking through the hallway. Then, on the quietest nights, from my brother's room, I would hear faint music. It sounded like a small orchestra, violins blending with a soft piano melody, echoing in the air. But when I asked my parents about it, they simply laughed, saying I had an overactive imagination. Things took a stranger turn when my brother, Lucas, started having nightmares. He would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, saying he saw a shadowy figure standing by his bed. My parents brushed it off as typical childhood fears, but I felt there was more to it. I started avoiding his room entirely, preferring the safety of the living room couch on nights when the house felt particularly eerie. As time passed, the sounds became a normal part of life. I stopped paying attention to them until I had my son, Ethan, who is now 3 years old. We turned Lucas's old room into Ethan's bedroom. He would often wake up in the middle of the night, crying and trembling. I would rush in to check on him, and he would stammer, "Scary mask, Mommy, scary mask." Things became stranger when Ethan started talking to himself in his room. First, I thought he was pretending to play with someone. Then, my mom, who often babysat him, told me he had a friend named Gobi. Hearing that name gave me chills. Ethan said Gobi was a girl who often played with him in the afternoons. When I asked him what Gobi looked like, he shrugged and said, "She's nice, but she wears a scary mask." One night, I overheard Ethan talking. His voice was soft, as if he were responding to someone I couldn't hear. I peeked into his room, expecting to find him playing with his toys. Instead, he was sitting on the floor, staring at the corner of the room, nodding as though listening to instructions. I called out, "Ethan, who are you talking to?" He turned to me with a serious expression. "Gobi says she's sad because she can't go home." A chill ran down my spine. I didn't know what to make of it. One day, during a random conversation with Lucas, I mentioned the odd sounds and the music in his old room. He went quiet for a moment and then looked at me with a serious expression. "You've never seen her, have you?" he asked. "Seen who?" I stammered. "The woman in the hallway," he replied. "She would stand there, watching our bedrooms. She looked like a Native American woman, but she didn't do anything, just stood there." A shiver ran down my spine. He had never told me this before. Why not? And why did both of us hear music in that room when no one else in the house did? Lucas went on to explain that he'd seen her multiple times growing up. She wore a long dress and had an otherworldly glow about her. First, he was terrified, but over time, he felt like she wasn't there to harm us. "It's like she's stuck," he said. "But stuck for what?" About a week later, while watching TV downstairs late at night, I heard the banging again, louder and more persistent than before. It wasn't just one wall. It sounded as though the entire house was groaning under some invisible weight. I ran upstairs, my heart pounding, to check on Ethan. He was sitting upright in bed, staring at the door. "She's mad," he whispered when he saw me. "She doesn't want you to yell at her anymore." I froze. "What do you mean, Ethan? You told her to leave. She doesn't like that." I didn't know how to respond. My son had no way of knowing about the night I'd yelled into the empty air. I hugged him tightly, promising to keep him safe. The next day, I decided I needed answers. I went to the local library and searched for old records about the house. What I found sent shivers down my spine. The house was built by the Gobineau family in the late 1800s, a wealthy French family who owned much of the land in the area. One tragic incident stood out. A servant girl of Native American descent had been reported missing from the property over a century ago. There were whispers that she had been killed by the family's eldest son after rejecting his advances. I also learned that the family had fled the house shortly after her disappearance. No charges were ever filed, and her body was never found. But local legends claimed her spirit haunted the land, seeking justice for her untimely death. That night, I decided to confront the spirit. I stayed in Ethan's room after he fell asleep, a candle flickering on the nightstand. I whispered into the darkness, "Gobineau, if you're here, I'm sorry for what happened to you. Please, tell me what you want." For a moment, there was silence. Then, the room grew cold, and the candle flickered wildly. In the faint light, I saw her, a young woman in a long dress, her face partially obscured by a mask-like shadow. Her eyes were filled with sadness. "Justice," she whispered. "Tell them what they did." I nodded, my voice trembling. "I will, I promise." She lingered for a moment longer before fading into the darkness. The next morning, I reached out to a local historian and shared what I'd found. With their help, we brought attention to the forgotten tragedy. An article was published, detailing the story of the young woman who had been wronged. A memorial was held on the property, with prayers and blessings offered in her honor. After that, the house became quieter. Ethan stopped talking about Gobi, and the strange noises faded away. But every now and then, late at night, I still hear faint music, soft violin notes drifting through the halls. Feels less eerie now, almost comforting, like a reminder that the past has finally been acknowledged. Though the house is peaceful, I can't help but wonder if Gobineau's spirit truly found her way home, or if a part of her will always remain here, a quiet guardian of the truth. This extended version adds more detail to the backstory, Ethan's experiences, and the confrontation with the spirit, making it richer and more immersive. Let me know if there are specific parts you'd like to expand further. The Silent Visitors. I was born and raised in Oregon, a lush and foggy state in the Pacific Northwest. Most of my childhood was spent in the small coastal town of Astoria, known for its mysterious stories and old-world charm. After getting married, I moved to a bigger city, but whenever I think about my childhood, I always remember my grandparents' house in Ravenwood. This little town was nestled deep in the forest, near a small branch of Highway 26, far away from the noise of the modern world. My grandmother, Mary, was a well-known medium in the area. Every Friday evening, she held seances at the old wooden house my grandfather, Henry, had built with the help of his cousin. The house was a two-story structure with rustic charm, featuring 2 bedrooms, a garage, and a wide wraparound porch. It sat at the end of a long gravel driveway, and anyone arriving would inevitably announce their presence with the crunching sound of tires on gravel, echoing through the quiet forest. Grandpa Henry was a skilled machinist, famous for his inventions in the timber industry. He had designed and patented sawmill machinery used all along the West Coast and even in Canada. His large workshop, located next to the house, was a hub of activity, filled with the hum of machines and the scent of oil and wood. Although he didn't believe in the supernatural, Grandpa never stopped Grandma Mary from hosting her seances. To him, it was simply her way of doing something she loved. It was an ordinary autumn evening, or so I thought. The sun had set earlier than usual, leaving the sky dark and foggy. The crisp air carried the earthy scent of fallen leaves and damp soil. I remember the exact date, October 13th, because I had just turned 16 a few days earlier. My father decided to bring me to one of Grandma Mary's seances, not because he believed in spirits, but because he thought it would be an interesting experience for me. By 7 p.m., Grandma's small living room was filled with familiar faces. There were about 10 people, including my father and me. The room was lit softly by the warm glow of antique table lamps. Heavy curtains covered the windows, but the porch door was slightly ajar, allowing the dim light from the street lamps outside to filter in, creating an eerie yet cozy atmosphere. At precisely 7:30, Grandma Mary began the seance. She sat at the head of the polished wooden table, her hands resting lightly on its surface. Closing her eyes, she spoke in a calm, steady voice, inviting the spirits to make their presence known. A few attendees mentioned feeling a chill or hearing faint whispers, but nothing extraordinary happened. Then, the sound came. From outside, we all heard it, the crunching of tires on gravel. It was unmistakable. A car turning off the highway and slowly making its way up the driveway. The sound grew louder, stopping directly beneath the front window. Then, the engine cut off, leaving an unsettling silence. Instinctively, I stood to look out the window. My father, sitting beside me, gently placed a hand on my shoulder and shook his head. "Stay put," he whispered, his gaze fixed on the window with a mix of curiosity and tension. The first car door creaked open, followed by the sound of footsteps on gravel. Then came a second door, and a third. Whoever it was, there were at least 3 of them. The footsteps shifted from gravel to grass, then onto the creaking wooden steps of the porch. They stopped just outside the front door. Grandpa Henry, who had been quietly sitting in his armchair by the fireplace, stood and walked to the window, ever the pragmatist. His curiosity seemed more irritated than concerned. As he pulled back the curtain to peer outside, his body froze, his posture stiffened, and his expression darkened. "What do you see?" Grandma Mary asked, her voice calm but tinged with unease. Grandpa didn't respond. He stepped aside, letting my father take a look. My father leaned forward, squinting into the darkness. A few seconds later, he, too, froze, gripping the curtain tightly. "There's nothing there," my father finally said, his voice low and strained. The rest of us exchanged uneasy glances. Surely they were mistaken. We had all heard the car pull in, the doors opening, the footsteps. It was impossible for nothing to be there. One by one, we approached the window, but everyone saw the same thing. The driveway was empty. The porch was bare. The faint glow of the streetlights illuminated only the gravel and grass. And then the sounds began again. We heard footsteps descending the porch stairs, walking across the grass, and crunching on the gravel as if someone or something was retracing their steps. Moments later, we heard car doors shutting, the engine starting, and the vehicle reversing down the driveway. But the driveway remained empty. That night, no one spoke much. Grandma Mary tried to resume the seance, but the energy in the room had shifted. Everyone seemed distracted, glancing nervously at the window. Eventually, guests began leaving early, muttering excuses about early mornings and long drives. The next morning, Grandpa Henry inspected the driveway and porch. There were no tire tracks, no scuffed gravel, no footprints, nothing to indicate anyone had been there at all. Years later, after both my grandparents had passed away, I returned to Ravenwood and visited their old house. It had been sold to a new family, but the memory of that night lingered in my mind. I decided to visit the local historical society to learn more about the area's history. What I discovered sent chills down my spine. In the early 1900s, a family of 3 had died in a car accident not far from the property. Their vehicle had veered off the road during a foggy night on their way to Ravenwood. They never made it to their destination. Some locals believed their spirits still roamed the area, forever trying to reach their intended stop. As I left the historical society, the memory of that autumn night resurfaced with startling clarity. The sounds, the footsteps, the invisible car, perhaps they were visitors from the past, seeking one final place to rest. Even now, whenever I hear the crunch of tires on gravel, I can't help but wonder, who or what is arriving? The man in the strange outfit. In the early 1990s, I lived in a small town called Greenville, deep in northern Maine, USA. The town was peaceful, but its isolation often made me uneasy, especially during long nights working late. One cold winter evening, my coworker and close friend, Sandra, and I left the office at about 10:45 p.m. We worked in an old building near Greenville's town center, which had been a warehouse in the 19th century before being converted into offices. The building sat next to a deserted road, surrounded by empty lots and a few crumbling, abandoned houses. As we stepped outside, the biting cold wind cut through our jackets. I tightened my coat around me, while Sandra clutched a bright red umbrella she had just bought from a nearby shop. I joked that there wasn't a single drop of rain, but she insisted the umbrella was beautiful and would come in handy. We quickly crossed the parking lot toward my car, an old, rusty blue sedan. Suddenly, from a distance, the headlights of a truck flared to life. It was parked in a shadowy corner of the lot, about 50 feet away. A large man climbed out of the truck, wearing a black jacket and a baseball cap that obscured his face. He stood there for a few seconds, motionless, as though studying us. "I don't like this," Sandra whispered, gripping her umbrella tightly. "Neither do I replied, trying not to let my fear show. We decided to pick up the pace, but just as we neared my car, I heard the sound of heavy footsteps behind us. Turning around, I saw the man running toward us at full speed. "Run!" I shouted. Sandra and I abandoned the car and sprinted toward the main road. The sound of his footsteps echoed behind us, mingling with our ragged breathing. The freezing wind burned our lungs, but fear drove us forward. We frantically waved at passing cars, begging for help, but none stopped. The dim streetlights above seemed to cast an even darker shadow over our situation. As we crossed a small intersection, Sandra stumbled and fell. I turned back to help her up, but before I could, the man caught up to us and grabbed the collar of my coat. Pain shot through me as I felt myself being pulled backward. I thought it was the end. In a moment of desperation, I spotted Sandra's red umbrella. Thinking quickly, she opened it and swung it hard at his face. Taken by surprise, he let go of me and shouted in pain. I pulled Sandra to her feet, and we bolted across the road. On the grassy median, we saw Arthur, or at least a man who looked like him. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, as though he had stepped out of the 1930s. A long overcoat, felt hat, and worn leather boots. He stood still, gazing off into the distance, seemingly oblivious to us running toward him. "Sir, please help us," I screamed, my voice cracking with panic. But he didn't move. He didn't even look at us. As we got closer, just a few steps away. He suddenly vanished, not walking away, not running, but dissolving into thin air like a wisp of smoke blown by the wind. A surprising rescue. We froze, stunned by what we had just witnessed. But there was no time to dwell on it because the man from the truck was still pursuing us. We sprinted toward the farmhouse where I lived, about half a mile away. When we reached the house, I banged on the door and screamed for help. The farmer, Bill, a strong middle-aged man, rushed out with a shotgun in hand. The moment our pursuer saw Bill, he hesitated, then turned and ran back the way he had come. Sandra and I immediately called the police. When they arrived and listened to our story, one of the officers, a woman named Helen, looked particularly alarmed. "The man you described," she said gravely, "matches the profile of a serial attacker we've been hunting. He assaulted a young woman nearby recently and has been on the run since." Helen then paused, her expression darkening. "But about the man on the median, you said he was wearing old-fashioned clothes and disappeared." I nodded, still trembling. "That could be Arthur Langley," she continued. "He lived near here in the 1930s. One night, while driving his family home, he had a terrible accident. The car flipped into a ditch, and he was badly injured. Arthur tried to walk to the village for help but never made it. His body was found days later, not far from the intersection you mentioned." Sandra and I looked at each other, chills running down our spines. It seemed that Arthur's spirit still lingered in the area, not to save his own family, but to protect those in danger, like us. That night, after the police left, Sandra and I sat together in the farmhouse kitchen. Although we were still shaken, I couldn't help but laugh when I saw Sandra clutching the red umbrella tightly, as if her life depended on it. I joked, "I guess that's the most useful umbrella in history." But deep down, I knew the real mystery wasn't the umbrella, it was Arthur, the man in the strange outfit, and the help he had given us from beyond the grave. This revised version replaces the lemon meringue pie with a red umbrella while maintaining the story structure and emotional impact. Let me know if you'd like further adjustments. The ghosts in the old house. From the age of 10 to 17, I lived with my family in an old Victorian house on the outskirts of a small town called Oakridge, surrounded by dense woods and a cobblestone road leading to the town center. The house was vast, with creaky floorboards, long corridors, and an unsettling quiet that hung in the air. Though beautiful in its architecture, it had a weight about it, as if the walls themselves were whispering secrets long forgotten. My parents were thrilled to own such a large house for a bargain price. To them, it was an incredible opportunity. But my sister, Lila, and I felt differently. From the moment we moved in, an unshakable feeling of unease settled over us. Something was wrong with the house, a sinister energy that neither of us could name. My bedroom was on the second floor, with a large window overlooking the forest at the back of the property. During the day, sunlight would filter through the tall trees, making the room feel almost serene. But when night fell, the atmosphere shifted entirely. The shadows seemed to grow longer, thicker, and the air felt cold, heavy with an unexplainable tension. One of the first nights after we moved in, I awoke to the sound of whispering. It was faint, like a hushed conversation happening just beyond my door. I crept out of bed, my heart pounding, and opened the door. The hallway was empty, bathed in dim light from the street lamp outside. I went back to bed, telling myself it was just the house settling. But the whispers returned. Night after night, They never grew louder, never became clear, but their presence was undeniable. And then there were the shadows. Late at night, I would often see something move in the corner of my room. Just out of the corner of my eye, I would turn to look, and nothing would be there. Once, I swore I saw a figure, a dark silhouette standing near the foot of my bed. But when I blinked, it was gone. One morning over breakfast, my mom casually mentioned that she had been having strange experiences of her own. I woke up last night feeling like someone was pulling the blanket off me, she said with a nervous laugh. I even thought Lila might have come into the room, but when I opened my eyes, there was no one there. Her words sent a chill down my spine. I hadn't told anyone about my experiences, but it seemed I wasn't the only one being targeted. My mom quickly brushed it off, saying it must have been her imagination, but the look in her eyes told me she wasn't so sure. Unable to bear the oppressive feeling in my room any longer, I moved into the guest room downstairs. It was smaller, less eerie, or so I thought. The first few nights were uneventful, and I started to believe I had escaped whatever haunted my bedroom. But then came the night that changed everything. I woke up to the sound of breathing, slow, shallow, and unnervingly close. It was coming from the top bunk of the old bunk bed in the room. I froze, too terrified to move. The breathing grew louder, more labored, as though whatever was there was struggling to draw air. Summoning every ounce of courage, I bolted out of bed and turned on the light. The room was empty. The sound had vanished, but the feeling of dread lingered, wrapping around me like a cold fog. I told my parents the next morning, but they dismissed it as old pipes. This house is ancient, my dad said. Things creak, pipes make noise. It's nothing, but I knew better. One evening, while exploring the house, Lila and I stumbled upon a locked door at the end of the upstairs hallway. It was small and inconspicuous, blending into the wall. "Have you ever been up there?" I asked my dad. He looked surprised. "That's the attic. I didn't even realize it had a lock." Curiosity got the better of us, and after some searching, my dad found the key. The door creaked open to reveal a narrow staircase leading up into darkness. The attic was filled with old furniture, dusty trunks, and forgotten relics. But what caught my attention was a small rocking chair in the corner. It was perfectly positioned to face a circular window that overlooked the backyard. The chair was moving, rocking ever so slightly, though there was no breeze. "What's that?" Lila whispered, pointing to a faded photo frame on the floor. I picked it up and brushed off the dust. It was a portrait of a little girl in a white dress, standing in front of what looked like our house. Her expression was somber, almost mournful. We didn't stay in the attic long. When I was 15, my best friend, Emily, came over to study. We were in the living room, chatting as we worked on a school project. Out of nowhere, Emily stopped mid-sentence, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Did that chair just move?" she whispered, pointing to the corner of the room. I followed her gaze to the desk chair, which was slowly spinning in a circle. The windows were closed, and there was no draft. It was impossible for it to move on its own. "Is this house haunted or something?" Emily asked, half joking but visibly uneasy. I hadn't told her about the strange happenings, but this confirmed what I already knew. Something in this house was alive, and it wasn't human. Lila had always refused to sleep in her own room. She would cry and beg to stay with our parents, claiming she was scared of the dark. But one day, when she was older, I asked her directly why she was so terrified. She hesitated, then said in a low voice, "I used to see a little girl in my room. She stood at the end of my bed, just staring at me. Sometimes I'd hear her whispering, like she was talking to someone. Her confession sent a chill down my spine. I remembered the portrait we'd found in the attic. Could the girl in the photo and the one Lila saw be the same? The night before we moved out, couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, listening to the house creak and groan, feeling the oppressive weight of its presence one last time. Just as I was about to drift off, I heard it, the sound of footsteps in the hallway. I sat up, heart pounding. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, moving closer to my door. The doorknob rattled slightly, as if someone was trying to turn it. Then, everything went silent. The next morning, as we packed the last of our belongings, I stood in my empty bedroom, staring at the now bare walls. The house felt colder, emptier, but the sense of being watched was stronger than ever. As I stepped out of the room, I heard a faint creak from the hallway. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know. Years later, I still wonder about that house. Was it truly haunted? Or were we just victims of an overactive imagination and the quirks of an old building? I'll never know for sure, but sometimes, in the dead of night, I think back to the whispers, the shadows, and the feeling of eyes watching from the dark. And I know one thing for certain: I'll never forget that house, or the things that refused to let us go. Thank you for spending your time with us tonight, exploring these mysterious and spine-chilling stories. If these tales have sparked your curiosity or left you with unforgettable feelings, don't hesitate to share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you've had similar paranormal experiences that you'd like to share, feel free to send your story to the email address provided in the description. Who knows? Your story might become part of our journey into the spiritual world in a future episode. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our haunting tales. See you in the next episode, and remember, always keep a light by your side.